Survival and loss during the Maryland campaign. The air in Maryland that September did not smell of harvest. It smelled of copper, stale sweat, and the pungent irony of blooming goldenrod amidst the rot of war. For Silas and Elias Thorne, the brothers who had once shared a bed in a small Virginia loft, the state line was more than a border. It was a jagged tear in the fabric of their souls. Silas marched with the Army of Northern Virginia. His boots were little more than flaps of leather bound by twine, his feet bleeding into the dusty soil of the Sharpsburg Turnpike. He was 19, but his eyes had the hollow, thousand-yard stare of a man who had seen the sun set over too many piles of unburied limbs. Beside him, the men of the 4th Virginia hummed Dixie, but the tune was thin, brittle as dry corn husks. "Stay close, Silas," his sergeant, a man named Miller with a face like etched granite, growled. "The Yanks are thick in those woods. They're defending their own doorsteps now. That makes a man dangerous." Silas didn't need the warning. He could feel the weight of the air. It was heavy, humid, and expectant. To the north, just miles away, his brother Elias was likely polishing a bayonet under the Union's blue banner. The thought was a dull ache in Silas's chest, sharper than the hunger gnawing at his stomach. The cornfield, where time stopped. The sun rose on September 17th like a bloodshot eye. By 6 a.m., the morning fog over Miller's cornfield was replaced by a sulphurous yellow haze. The Maryland campaign, meant to bring the war to a decisive end, had instead descended into a meat grinder. "Forward!" the command echoed. Silas stepped into the tall stalks of corn. It was a beautiful crop, high and green, the pride of some farmer who had likely fled in terror. Within minutes, the stalks weren't being harvested by sickles, but by lead. The sound was like a rhythmic clipping. Zip, zip, thud. "God save us!" a boy to Silas's left screamed as his shoulder exploded in a spray of crimson. Silas didn't look. He couldn't. He leveled his Enfield rifle and fired into the smoke. He wasn't aiming at men anymore. He was aiming at the ghosts in the mist. He reloaded with trembling hands, tear the cartridge, pour the powder, ram the ball, cap the nipple. He did it by muscle memory, even as the world around him dissolved into a symphony of shrieks and whistles. Across the field, tucked behind a limestone wall, Elias Thorne gripped his Springfield. He wore the dark blue of the Iron Brigade. He saw a line of gray rags emerging from the corn. He saw the tattered stars and bars waving defiantly. For a split second, he looked for a familiar gait, a certain tilt of a head that might belong to his brother. "Fire!" his captain roared. Elias pulled the trigger. The recoil bruised his shoulder, a familiar pain. He watched as the gray line buckled. He saw a young Confederate soldier fall, clutching his throat. Elias felt a wave of nausea. "Is that him? Did I just kill my mother's youngest son?" The price of the sun. By midday, the cornfield was no longer a field. It was a floor of broken bodies. The Maryland soil, rich and dark, had turned into a muddy red soup. Silas found himself slumped against a splintered oak tree, his canteen empty, his arm grazed by a mini-ball that had taken a chunk of his flesh but spared the bone. He looked around and saw Sergeant Miller. The man who seemed made of stone was sitting upright, eyes wide open, but the bottom half of his face was gone. Silas didn't cry. He was past tears. He just watched a butterfly land on Sergeant Miller's shoulder, its yellow wings flickering against the gray wool of the dead man's jacket. It was the cruelest thing Silas had ever seen. The loss wasn't just the men. It was the loss of the idea that this war would be glorious. In the Maryland campaign, survival wasn't a badge of honor. It was a haunting accident. As the sun began to dip, casting long skeletal shadows over the sunken road, soon to be known as Bloody Lane, the firing slowed to a ragged pulse. The brothers were still alive, separated by less than a mile of charred earth and 10,000 dead men. Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled letter from home. It was stained with his own blood. He didn't read it. He just held it, a small piece of white paper against the overwhelming gray of the world, wondering if the soil of Maryland would ever grow anything but ghosts again. The Search Among the Shadows. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the battlefield of Antietam transformed into a landscape of flickering lanterns and rhythmic moans. The bloodiest day had ended, but for Elias Thorne, the true horror was only beginning. While the Union officers toasted to a tactical victory that stopped Lee's invasion, Elias stood on the edge of the sunken road. The air was thick with the smell of iron and wood smoke. He walked with a limp, not from a wound, but from sheer exhaustion. Every few steps, he leaned over a body dressed in gray, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Silas?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "Silas, you there?" He wasn't supposed to be here. He was supposed to be back at the bivouac, cleaning his rifle and eating salt pork. But the blood on his hands, Confederate blood, felt like a brand. He had spent the day firing into the cornfield, and every time he saw a rebel fall, he saw his brother's face. The surgeon's table. Elias followed the trail of the wounded toward a nearby barn that had been converted into a field hospital. The sight was worse than the battle. Outside, a literal pile of discarded limbs, arms, legs, hands, grew taller by the hour. The screams inside were not human. They were the sounds of men being unmade. He pushed past a weary sentry and entered the barn. The light of a dozen candles cast long, distorted shadows on the rafters. Surgeons, their aprons soaked in deep, dark crimson, worked with terrifying speed. "Move aside, soldier," a nurse barked. She was carrying a basin of pink water. Elias scanned the rows of men lying on straw. Some wore blue, some wore gray. In the face of a saw and a bandage, the color of the uniform no longer mattered. They were just broken boys. He reached the back of the barn where the hopeless cases were laid. There, tucked in a corner, sat a young man with a familiar shock of sandy hair. Elias's breath hitched. He lunged forward, nearly tripping over a dying corporal. "Elias!" The boy turned his head. It wasn't Silas. It was a stranger from Georgia, no older than 16, his eyes clouded with the onset of shock. He looked at Elias's blue and flinched. Don't hurt me no more," the boy rasped. Elias sank to his knees, the weight of the day finally crushing him. He took the stranger's hand, the enemy's hand, and held it tight. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm just looking for my brother. We're all brothers here. Just some of us forgot it for a while," the boy whispered, his grip weakening. Elias stayed with the boy until the grip went cold. He walked out of the barn into the cold Maryland night, looking up at the same stars his mother would be seeing back in Virginia. The Maryland campaign had been sold as a grand strategy of survival for the North and a quest for independence for the South. But standing amidst the thousands of cooling bodies, Elias realized the only thing that had survived was the grief. He reached into his tunic and pulled out a small silver locket with a picture of his mother and Silas. He pressed it to his lips. Silas was still out there, somewhere in the retreat, or buried in a trench he had yet to find. The war had taken their home, their peace, and now their proximity. "I'll find you, Silas," Elias vowed to the darkness. even if I have to walk through every graveyard in this country.